Hello, church. Thank you for joining me. We're in this study, The One Thing, and it's all in 1 Corinthians, the whole book of 1 Corinthians, really. And the one thing is the gospel. Everything in 1 Corinthians is related back to the gospel. And today we're going to be looking at God's wisdom versus man's wisdom. And really, it's God's power that we're looking at. So the one thing is God's wisdom today. And we're going to start here. We're going to go through verses 18 all the way through the end of chapter 1 into verse 5 of chapter 2. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God, through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. And because of him, you are in Christ Jesus, who became to us wisdom from God, righteousness and sanctification and redemption. So that, as it is written, let the one who boasts, boast in the Lord. And I, when I came to you, brothers, did not come proclaiming to you the testimony of God with lofty speech or wisdom. For I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. And I was with you in weakness and in fear and much trembling. And my speech and my message were not in plausible words of wisdom, but in demonstration of the Spirit and of power, so that your faith might not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Let's unpack this passage. Let's start with the first part of verse 18. The message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. Now, God's people, the Jews, had been waiting for Christ to come for centuries. The Messiah was coming. So what would the wise tell us how things should have been? So if you're thinking through, how would the Messiah show up? A great king, coming to power, amassing wealth, respect, kingdoms and armies, and then conquering all the enemies. That's kind of what the disciples, as well as the Jews, were waiting for. But that's worldly wisdom. That's the way of the world. That's how the world would expect the story to go. It's not what God had planned at all. It's not what God, in his wisdom, decided should happen. When the long-awaited Messiah came, Jesus, the Christ, what happened? Well, he traveled around with a relatively small following for a few years before he finally got arrested and then nailed to a cross. Humiliated, despised, and rejected, with all of his followers and friends deserting him except for a small little handful, leaving him to die a cruel and painful death alone at the hands of the Romans. How could that possibly be God's powerful Christ? That couldn't be the Christ. Surely not. There's no wisdom in that. Verse 22 and 23. Jews demand miracles and Greeks look for wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. You see, the Jews wanted to see a display of power over their enemies. And the Gentiles and the Greeks in this passage, the Greeks, but Gentiles too, the message was foolish to them with their quest to find God through their own wisdom and philosophies. But for all its impressiveness, human wisdom fails, because by human wisdom, we cannot know God. Look at the first half of verse 21. In the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him. You know, it's always been human wisdom, man's reasoning, that says, I could find God in my own way. Look at this picture in Rome. There's a landmark known as Pilate's Steps. They're the steps Jesus used on his way to be tried by Pontius Pilate before his crucifixion. And they moved him from Jerusalem over to Rome. There's a sign next to the steps which says that if you get on your knees and pray a special prayer on every step, then God will be more lenient on you on your judgment day, on the judgment day. Now, as people look at that and they look at the people going up the steps, praying on their knees, they could think, oh, that's impressive, or that's very wise, very humbling thing to do. But really, in reality, it's nothing more than pride and foolishness. Foolishness to think that without the cross, without Jesus' blood, we can earn our standing before God. Human wisdom is not the way to know God. So what is God's plan? Verse 21. For since in the wisdom of God, the world through its wisdom did not know him, God was pleased through the foolishness of what was preached to save those who believe. The foolish message of the cross is actually a powerful message. And in God's wisdom, it's the only way to be saved. Verse 19, for it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the intelligence of the intelligent. I will frustrate. Where is the wise man? Where is the scholar? Where is the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? Now, it is an exclusive claim. It's really at the heart of Christianity. No other way to be saved. No other way to know God. Not because that's what I may think or even what you may think, but because that's what God planned it out to be. In his wisdom, it's his decision. He decided it to be that way. Now, it's an unpopular, exclusive claim of Jesus that he is the only way, and it doesn't sit well with the wisdom of the world. Don't be surprised when people say that it's foolish, it's intolerant, it's a wrong message. Verse 18, for the wisdom of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The message of Christ crucified is and always will be the message that the world needs to hear. Paul goes on to say that it's not only the message that is unimpressive in the world's eyes in wisdom, the people who believe it are also unimpressive by worldly standards. Verse 26 through 28. Brothers, think of what you were when you were called. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were influential. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. He chose the lowly things of the world and the despised things and the things that are not to nullify the things that are. It's not in the wisdom of impressive people that God is known, but it's through the foolish message of a crucified Lord, of Jesus hanging on the cross. It's not because of us, but because of God that we are saved. It's everything that he has done, nothing we do. This message, and this really means that there's no room for boasting in human achievement when it comes to salvation. It's a gift from God. Verse 31 sums it up perfectly. Paul's here is quoting from Jeremiah. Therefore, as it is written, let him who boasts, boast in the Lord. Remember, it doesn't matter how smart people are, how many degrees they have, how influential and respected they are. If they haven't put their trust in Jesus, then in God's eyes, they will actually be a greater fool on Judgment Day. But it's not only an unimpressive message in the eyes of the world, in the wisdom of the world, and unimpressive people. Paul was an unimpressive messenger. He says in verse 1 of chapter 2, "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom, as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God." In those days, public speaking was like a sport. It was done with a lot of flair and eloquence. It was very showy and clever. And from what we read in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's clear that the Corinthians there, the people that live in Corinth, strongly valued this eloquent style of speaking. And they looked down on Paul because of it. They thought that he didn't have anything worth listening to because he wasn't a fancy speaker. See, he didn't want to impress on a human level. He wanted to do one thing, the one thing, and really one thing only. In verse 2 he says, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." He didn't want there to be any gloss and frills and hype. He wanted a simple and clear presentation of the message of Jesus and his death. For Paul, what was more important than being fancy and clever was being simple, clear, and Christ-centered. In fact, he says in verse 3 that when he preached the gospel to them, he came in weakness and in fear with much trembling. Look at verse 4. "My message and my preaching were not with wise and persuasive words, but with a demonstration of the Spirit's power, so that your faith might not rest on men's wisdom, but on God's power." Those who believed his message did so through the clear, simple preaching of Christ crucified. They believed because of the power of God through the gospel, and their faith would rest on God, not on a clever salesman. How about you? Does your thought process get in the way of knowing Jesus? Does your wisdom stop you from receiving God's wisdom? God's power is demonstrated by people, you and me, hearing the gospel and believing.